Hello and welcome to the last of the part 1 video lessons. If you remember, 30 out of 50 marks are covering period 1900 to 1918. In reality, all your questions are most likely to be only on the topic of one video, but you do not know which, like a game of Russian roulette. So, usual disclaimer, no specific facts here, you need to research those. This is for analysis, otherwise these things will be longer than 40 minutes to pop. Today we're going to be finishing off World War I by looking about how it transformed politics. Now, we looked at it a little bit actually when we talked about unions and women. We were thinking more about the political parties. And if we look at one of my favourite diagrams, because I like pictures with bright colours and that makes shapes and stuff, this clearly shows that in between 1910 and 1918 we see a significant change in the nature of the electoral geography in Britain. We see the first, and if you look at the trend, the beginning of the end of the Liberal Party as a party opposition. And we see a significant rise in the role, size and confidence of the Labour Party, projecting it very quickly into the natural party of government and a natural party of opposition. So what we're going to look at today is what happens to the Liberal Party as a result of the war, and why does it explain this drop, and what happens to the Labour Party during the war, and how that explains why it rose. Nothing is as simple as one side has dropped. It is always someone drops and someone rises. So, Liberals, and let's go. Okay, and I've already noticed one typo in the first line. So, the Liberals. If we think what the pattern is to, up until the war, then we can see how the war affects it. The story behind both parties is actually there's a long-term trend happening, and all the war does is aggravate that trend to speed it up. It catalyses the long-term decline of the Liberals, and it catalyses the long-term rise of the Labour Party. Now, arguably, stuff happens in the war which, had it not happened to Liberals and had it not happened to Labour, arguably we might not necessarily see the rises and nowhere near as fast that we saw in the end. But still, there is the argument that the war does not massively create, apart from one or two events, fundamental changes. It just speeds them up. So the Liberals have always been ideologically split. And even before the New Liberals, Gladstonian was split over imperialism and not, etc., etc. That's just the Liberal way. If you remember, we have the Gladstonians, who are centre-right, laissez-faire, low state intervention, low reform, and far less populist. It almost disdains at giving cheap stuff to the people as a circus act. Whereas the New Liberals, centrists, more plain, more state intervention, more reform, keen to harness population and labour. Gladstonian is manifested in Asquith, although he's actually errs on the side of New Liberalism, but he's temperamentally Gladstonian, and David Lloyd George is a New Liberal. At the same time, you have David Lloyd George up until 1914 waiting in the wings as part of his irresistible rise to power. So you have a very, very, very capable leader, but also he's all deeply ambitious, and he's always been like that. But he's not he's not stabbed anyone in the back, partly because there's not been an opportunity. And again, while there are these divisions, there's not actually been that much tearing apart of the Liberal Party yet, largely because there hasn't been that many wedge issues which the New Liberals and the Gladstonians will fundamentally differ on, and therefore be forced to split on. And also, the Liberals spent most of the late 19th century out of power, so they are still keen to paper over the cracks and make compromises in order to finally enjoy power, and they've got it. The lessons of the 1880s and 1890s have burned it quite well into them. So the Liberals, although there are long-term splits, in reality are a fairly unified force up until 1914. And I think you can guess what's about to happen. So, what World War I essentially does is it precipitates a split in the Liberals. It's two forces which hurt the Liberals. Is number one, it splits the party, and number two, it leads to the rise of Labour, who displays it electorally. So we're going to talk about the rise of Labour separately, but always bear in mind one of the points which destroys Liberals is the rise of Labour. Now, as we've mentioned, fighting a total war presents a unique ideological challenge. and a particularly damaging one to the Liberals, because in reality it becomes a wedge issue. The war, as Asquith found, desperately requires total war, mass mobilisation, massively increased role of the state, which is an anathema to what the classical Gladstonian Liberals want. And you can argue, therefore, what this forces, unlike what was going on before, is the new Liberals to start looking at the Gladstonians as individuals who are hurting the war effort because of wrong ideological judgments. And likewise, the Gladstonians start noticing their differences in New Liberals and start becoming hostile to New Liberals, and who they suspect are using the war as an excuse to basically fundamentally destroy liberal values and turn to some sort of light socialism. So what happens as a result of the ideological challenges is the party begins to already ideologically split, and hostility between the party already grows even before the leadership crisis. And then there's a leadership battle, the leadership crisis in December 1916, and that permanently and so obviously splits the party. Okay, so leading up to that point, the Liberals lose a lot of support from many groups in society who look at the handling of the war in the early years and judge Asquith. And this means that even when Asquith is running for prime ministership or running for office in 1918 and 1922, many people will not forgive him or vote for him because of how poorly he ran the war. And so that has had a massive effect on his branch of the party. And this is why, of the four major parties, if you split the Liberals into two, his party does disproportionately badly. But the key thing the Liberals in World War II experience is a fundamental split. Now, it is one thing about having an ideological split. If faceless MP drone number 1 dislikes faceless MP drone number 2 over an ideological issue, that does not matter. Okay, but because of the nature of the split, because Asquith saw it as backstabbing, okay, particularly, there is now two factions whose disagreements have gone beyond an ideological disagreement. The two individuals whose hatred, and it is hatred, is visceral and personal. Now, it's one thing trying to knit a party back together if there's a difference of opinion and ideology. That's hard. But when the two leaders categorically refuse to work with each other, and actually, as can be seen by the Morris debates, go out of their way to destroy the other, it is almost two men towel lead the faction. It almost makes it impossible to knit together the party. And so what it really does is it entrenches the ideological divisions. I mean, you really must make that clear in your exam. It's not as simple as saying, oh yeah, the leadership split the party. Ideologically, yes, it split it, but it also made it far more entrenched because it became a personal split. You are either loyal to him or you are loyal to him, and there is no middle ground. It's like a bad breakup. So fundamentally, because of this split, the Liberal Party becomes unelectable. It loses a sense of direction. It loses a sense of what it means to be liberal. They spend a lot of energy fighting each other. Asquith hasn't defined what his party is compared to Labour and Conservatives. David Lloyd George has not done his. And people look at the Liberals and their splits and the fact they run two completely different parties in 1918 and then say, well, these aren't the proper mature party of government, and instead go and vote for the Labour Party. Similarly, because they are lacking unity, what they do is they split the vote. And we've already mentioned how bad that is. However bad it is for Labour and Liberals, who share some voters, to split the vote, if you have two Liberal parties, you're only going to split the vote even more. And therefore what happens is, across electoral districts in 1918 and 1922, having two separate Liberal parties, one led by the Asquith, one led by David Lloyd George, fundamentally means that they're both split across the board, and Labour Party takes it when they takes the seat, or Tories take the seat. If you imagine that 40% of the people are Liberal, and then 30% are Labour, 30% are Tories, normally the Liberals will win that seat comfortably. But what happens is you've got 20% of those Liberals voting for Asquith, 20% voting for David Lloyd George, 30% for Labour, 30% for Tories. So either the Tories or Labour win. And so that really then completely destroys the electoral base. This gives Labour an opportunity then to come in and take those seats and look more like a responsible party of government and prove itself as that responsible party of government, and therefore mean that people switching their vote is permanent. And that's the key thing, because eventually what happens is the Liberal Party reunites when they realise how catastrophic being two separate parties is. But by that point, many people have stopped looking upon the Liberals as a party who is sensible, mature and able to run the country, and instead have been convinced by Labour as a viable political party, and they do not go back. Okay? Arguably, a slightly more meta argument is because of the split, David Lloyd George therefore has to, because he's David Lloyd George, he wants to stay in power, has to form the coalition. It drives David Lloyd George into the coalition of Conservatives. And then, as we shall see in that video lesson, which we're not going to do this week, because he's now dependent on the Conservatives, you can argue that means his fall is inevitable. And so you can say what the split does, split equals coalition equals David Lloyd George's fall. So therefore the split equals David Lloyd George's fall. Okay, if you think of some sort of roundabout algebra. So essentially what the war does is, by creating wedge issues between the party, it stretches the ideological division and ideological hostility between the two wings of the party, which is then sealed and entrenched by the actual split in 1916, and only made more secure by stuff like the Morris debates. This means that they are unable to fight in the elections of 1918 effectively. They are divided, they lack legitimacy, they lack a core message, and that means Labour comes in and proves itself as a respectable party of government. That is key. Right, moving on to the Labour Party. Now, do not take the rise of the Labour Party for granted. The Labour Party, as we shall discuss, is actually not necessarily going to become a party of government. Remember, it is battling several key problems, okay? In theory, it should do really well. It had most people in Britain are poor, and therefore, if you're the party of the poor, you already have a mass electorate. You already have a lot of grassroots organisations, particularly in the unions, and you lack ideological baggage, i.e. you don't have to make a position, because that's what the Labour Party has always had a position on. Okay, you get to pick and choose what suits you. However, the structure of the Labour Party up until 1918 fundamentally makes it weak. It is a loose-knit herd of cats of different groups and different visions, different ideals. You have from radical socialists to gradualists to centrists to essential liberals in all but name, from the ILP, unions, socialists and all of that sort of stuff, Fabians. And because of this, it's very difficult for the Labour Party to effectively organise one policy, one message, to fight elections in an organised fashion, and to present themselves as a well-organised, slick, professional body. And this means that essentially they cannot really make policy. It cripples their effectiveness. They can't, and it means that every policy may lead to a massive argument and disunity. Because if the ILP doesn't like the policy of nationalisation but the Fabians do, or vice versa, then they will walk or they'll have an argument. And in the public, if you have a massive argument inside your party, people tend not to think it's a sensible party of government. So arguably, this division and this herd of cat mentality should fail. What keeps it moderate and therefore electable, and what keeps everyone working in the same direction, is two things: Ramsay MacDonald and the unions. Now, Ramsay MacDonald is very good at keeping everyone together by giving the illusion of being a true socialist. One of the most cutting things Beatrice Webb of the Fabians ever described MacDonald as is she described him as a magnificent substitute for a leader. I.e., he is someone who looks the part in his high-minded speeches, but actually doesn't lead the government towards socialism. It's far more focused on making the party look electable and long-term vision, as opposed to being a socialist and things. He is actually a socialist, but one who is very deeply focused on parliamentary democracy in the long term. He is superhuman in his ability to keep this bag of cats roughly together, not doing crazy things which will then offend the electorate. And that requires respect, if not adoration. Okay, so MacDonald is absolutely key to stop them doing crazy things. But you cannot build a party simply by the absence of crazy things. You also need to be quite organised. You also need a quite series of policies. And the Labour Party finds it very difficult to do that, have organised elections, have organised policies, because they're so divided. What also helps the party stay moderate is the fact that the group which is significantly stronger than everyone else, the pig amongst guinea pigs, shall we say, of the Labour Party is the unions. They provide the mass of members, the mass of money. And because fundamentally their money is used to fund the Labour Party, they have so much more leverage over the party. And because they are not socialist in anything but rhetoric, and because they are fundamentally moderate, they force the rest of the party, even if they throw a strop, much like an 8-year-old who says they're leaving home, they realise they need to be fed and housed, so they only storm out and hang in the garden for about 10 minutes. That's essentially what all these different groups do. They storm off, but then they essentially don't leave the party, and they reluctantly buy in and agree to the moderate party line, because there's no chance of them on their own outside. The union and the Labour Party of the unions is just too strong, and it's better to be inside the tent than outside. So essentially, we have an opportunity, we have a threat, fundamental division, but we have an opportunity in a deeply effective leader and a union core which acts as a moderating influence. And you also have the Parliamentary Labour Party, the PLP, i.e. the MPs in Parliament, who again, because they are there for a significant period of time, and essentially what the Labour Party has been doing since their first meaningful core of MPs in 1906 is wearing suits, sitting in Parliament, not being absolutely crazy socialist, and bleeding into the public consciousness that actually A, Labour is a party, B, Labour is a party of its own right, and C, it's not crazy socialist. And that helps over time gradually persuade people that these are not a bunch of reckless trots who are desperately trying to destroy capitalism and democracy and put you and your daughters up against the wall to be shot. They are reasonable working class men out for a little bit more equality, and without that you cannot get the masses to vote for you. So essentially it looks good, but not so good. It is an opportunity rather than a guaranteed cert. It needs to be played well. It could just as easily go vastly, vastly wrong. Now, in reality, it doesn't look good from the start of the war. Ramsay MacDonald is a very funny old goat. He doesn't believe in anything. Well, at least he doesn't believe in socialism. He focuses on long term. But he is also a very, very strong pacifist. And rather than be part of the government, which is undertaking the war, he decides to resign as party leader. Okay? It's interesting he chooses to do this. He could decide to remove his party from government. Again, not join the coalition, not be involved in the running of the war, and become the pacifistic party. But he knows in his heart that that's not a politically popular decision, and that's not therefore sensible for the Labour Party. The Labour Party would suffer as a result. So rather than have to either compromise his ideals and help the government fight the war, or compromise the party's long-term future by doing what he believes is right, but hurting the image in the public, because it's so easy then to attack the Labour Party as anti-patriotic, he then resigns and is replaced by Henderson. And Henderson is more left-wing and just more, well, is just not as good, essentially. And Henderson very quickly allows himself to be ignored by the majority of the government and spends his time doing silly things, which we'll talk about in a second. But despite the fact you've got Henderson, this does not mean the party will lurch to the left, because ultimately you can have Henderson, you can have Karl Marx himself, in charge. But ultimately, since the unions have all the power, remember they dominate the committee, they dominate the funding, they dominate the membership, they ultimately have the leverage. So although you have Henderson, Ramsay MacDonald is still in the Labour Party. He's still hanging about. He's still behind the scenes, making sure that the unions are in touch with the rest of the party, etc., etc. And therefore, there's no real crazy stuff on a policy level. Now, Henderson will do his own crazy things, and as we will talk about in a second, but it's not policy based. And therefore, if you make it about a man making a mistake rather than the party's policy, it's easier to avoid people disliking you. So how does the war treat the Labour Party? So, although there is a division about support for the war, the official socialist position on most wars are that they are an imperialist venture of capitalists either to generate more income for themselves or to hurl working class men from one country, to kill working class men in another country, to distract them from the fact that actually they are, both sides are being oppressed. Almost a conspiracy of imperialists. Because British socialism isn't actually that Marxist, it's much more actually it has a massive influence of Christian existentialism to it. Dostoevsky is often more influential than Engels. We therefore tend to have pacifism on moral grounds, i.e. war is bad, very Christian based rather than ideologically based. And so because of this, there isn't really, and because most people in the Labour Party are fundamentally moderate and understand that there's a bigger political game on, and also are working class, and therefore relatively socially conservative and relatively in for the whole patriotism flag waving thing that the war demands, there is a fundamental understanding of the division. So while there is a split, there isn't an argument over it. Essentially, the party stays committed to the war. MacDonald, etc., resigns, but they still hang around the party, and people don't judge them or think that they are betraying the cause as a result, because they have so cleanly left to some extent. Okay? So during the war, the Labour Party essentially disappears, at least in policy making. It's in David Lloyd George's interest to be the one talking to the unions, the one making all the policies which are reforms. This helps brand him and the Liberals as the people the working classes should vote for and not the Labour Party. So he almost deliberately keeps them on the margins. If you remember, Henderson in the cabinet is Education Minister, which that does not change. And so therefore the Labour Party have no real impact on policy in any way, shape or form. However, what is significant about the war is because there is an absence of policy, and because the unions only grow stronger during the war, they become bolder. And because it increasingly looks like that there is going to be universal manhood suffrage at the end of the war, they increasingly get confident that actually the Labour Party is a viable thing. This could work. This could actually, lead to Labour government at some point. So what essentially it leads to is organisational changes as opposed to policy changes. And what this period does essentially is it allows the Labour Party to start unifying and becoming a more formalised, organised political party. If we think the fundamental weakness of the Labour Party is that it's divided between all these different factions, the one thing you need to fix it is, well, two things you need to do, is put the ruling executive, the NEC, the group which decides the major policies for the Labour Party, you put that under control of moderates, under control of reliable people who will, rather than argue amongst themselves, will follow a moderate union-backed party line. And you turn the party away from being a random collection of different groups into an actual party which everyone is a member of. Because previously you weren't a member of the Labour Party, you were a member of the Fabians who are part of the LRC, who would call themselves the Labour Party. You remember the ILP who remember the Labour Party. You could not join the Labour Party just as a member. You had to be part of one of these other groups. It was like a collective rather than a political party. So what essentially happens in 1917 is the unions make a mega power play, supported by MacDonald behind the scenes. And essentially, they make in the party conference of that year, they make the election of the NEC, the people who ultimately decide the policies and direction of the party. Although the leader has a say in this, the NEC is the power behind the throne. They make that based on the conference vote rather than what was there before, which was ILP get 2 seats, Fabian get 2 seats, etc., etc., etc. So what this means is we go from a situation where the NEC, every tiny group has a say on the NEC, to it's about the numbers. And naturally, the trade unions, who don't have one vote, but they have a vote for all their members, so the miners' union will have a vote for around 90 to 120,000 votes, dominate. They completely win. The Fabians, with a couple of thousand people, have no chance to win an election now. So what essentially happens is, as a result of this, is the NEC becomes controlled by the unions and their block vote. Now, party members and local party can vote and they have a say, but the unions are the most organised, most strategically minded and most structured group and most numerous group who can vote in these conferences and therefore control. Now, you can argue this is deeply helpful for the party to get elected because it forces moderation, and it also means that most people on the NEC all know each other, they're all union-backed people, and therefore they're all relatively organised and relatively sensible. And therefore the party is more electable, has clearer policies, is more unified, gets stuff done, and therefore makes it more electable. So that's the first major thing. We'll jump the next bullet point for a second. The second thing they do is they change the 1918 Constitution. Okay. Essentially, what this does is increases the power of the party conference, which again improves the trade unions. But as well as this, it now makes it everyone is a member of the Labour Party, not simply a member of the Fabians. And you can join the party as a party member, not as a member of these other groups. Essentially what it does is it reduces the power of all these little wee groups and makes the party a smudged in whole homogeneous mass. And therefore the little specks of Fabianism, the little specks of ILP disappear. They have less say now because now it's a proper official party, which the only people who have any power are the NEC. The NEC, as what happened last year, is completely controlled by the unions, and therefore what happens is we have one party and the power of the individual groups is now negligible. They do still exist, but they have no power in conferences because they're too small. They have no power of the NEC because they don't have the votes to vote for it. And now people don't even have to be members of the ILP. They can just join the Labour Party. And what happens instead is most people who want to join do not join the ILP or the Fabians, they join their local party. And over time, this simply means the number of members of these ILP, Fabians, etc. get smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, what this means is they are much better organised, much better run, much better almost disciplined in order to win the election. Now, this constitution does bring some more radical elements in it. It is written by Henderson, because although, as we will talk about in a second, he's kicked out of office, he still has a lot of power behind the scenes. And he uses the conference to sign the constitution, and the unionists basically let them do this because it doesn't really matter, and it makes it look like everyone can agree, and that always helps if everyone agrees to the constitution. And there are parts of the constitution which are quite radical. Clause 4, which demands the nationalisation of industry, a very socialist idea, is part of it. And so you can argue, well, this actually is counterproductive. It harms the image that the Labour Party is fundamentally a moderate force. But in reality, stuff like Clause 4 are statements of intent, are rhetoric rather than policy. And so what happens is they have Clause 4 which says we are going to nationalise all the industry, but whenever there's a Labour government, they never do it. And whenever there's an election, they never say they're going to do it. It's a relic, it's a touchstone, it doesn't necessarily have any moral weight. So just because you've got in Clause 4, we are going to nationalise everything, doesn't actually mean they are ever going to nationalise everything or say they're going to nationalise everything. They say it, they have it there almost as this is what we used to do when this is what we fundamentally believe, but actually, we don't actually want to do this. Now, one thing that does happen negatively to Labour in this period is they're at the mercy of events. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917, the Bolshevik socialists take over and they very promptly start killing people. And that doesn't massively sell socialism very well. And similarly, the Henderson, who's the leader, randomly decides he wants to go to to Stockholm to the International Socialist Congress, where there would also be members of the German SPD. The German SPD, like the Labour Party, support the German war effort, like the Labour Party supports the British war effort. Now, obviously, this is a bad idea. This is bad propaganda. This is obviously then gives David Lloyd George and the Tories a great opportunity to paint the Labour Party as idealistic, as ideological and anti-patriotic. And although these two events certainly don't help, in reality they don't harm the Labour Party too much. First things first, the Labour Party is so obviously conservative and deliberately avoids making any praise or any meaningful way of the Russian Revolution, or even though just behind the scenes they actually want, Henderson wants David Lloyd George to start making friends with the Russians. And therefore that isn't, although that's for some people that persuades a fear of the Labour Party, those people are probably never going to vote for the Labour Party anyway, so it doesn't really make a difference. And the Henderson stuff, well, yes, he has made a joke of and he's laughed at and he's seen as betrayal, but the Labour Party very quickly fire him and replace him with someone else. And nothing sends a message like he's not one of us than that. And so you can argue that's very good damage limitation. So while Henderson's actions around Stockholm and around the Russian Revolution don't necessarily help the party and lead to some negative comment, and the Tories and Liberals who are all so keen to challenge and attack the Labour Party, because of that, they because of their quick response to this, the damage is very, very limited, and so therefore we don't see too much effect on this. So, how does the war therefore help Labour? Well, there's numerous effects of the war to help the Labour Party increasingly be more likely to win the election in 1918. Number one, Labour's proposal in 1910 about nationalising industry and about increasing the role of the state was out there, was a bit crazy sounding at 1910 and 1911. But the war leads to a massive role of the state and nationalisation and all those things, massive increase in taxation, etc. And so what it does is it actually gets people used to the idea and used to the arguments that Labour has been going along with the whole time. And it makes the idea of nationalisation seem less radical. Because if the Liberal government did it and the world still existed, the sky was still up and the land was still down and there wasn't socialist paradise, therefore actually many people were less terrified by the idea of nationalisation now. In fact, they saw what it did to the miners and the mines, and it actually helped them and actually increased efficiency, and go, actually, is that a bad thing? So because the war leads to an increase in the role of the state, the policies of Labour, which naturally also call for an increase in the role of the state, seem less radical. Similarly, because they play the war well, they make sure they are assiduously patriotic. The pacifists resign, Henderson is kicked out, and they support the war all the way through. They keep this image of they are a legitimate, sensible party of government. They resist the temptation of certain members of their left wing to be pacifistic or criticise the war. Okay, but more than that, and it's in bold, so you know it's important. The most important factor is the fact that the Labour Party, during the war, arguably helped by the space created by the war and the increased confidence of the unions, increasingly becomes centralised and dominated by the moderates, both within the party and primarily the unions. And these people are interested far more in winning elections and gradual social change than ideology. And if you have people in charge of a party who care about ideology over elections, you don't win elections. If you have people who understand that they need to win an election to get any change, and ideology needs to be shaped into what people want to hear in order for you to win that elections, you tend to win more elections. Okay? Despite the chance they might do, because of the maturity of MacDonald and the fact that you have one pig amongst guinea pigs of the unions, there aren't any major painful splits compared to Liberals. Okay, part of the way that MacDonald helped get, and the Labour Party helped get around differences in opinion and ideology, is they had a really, really, really socialist foreign policy and just didn't talk about domestic policy. If you don't want domestic policy, everyone's going to argue about if you're going to nationalise, if you're going to not, if you're going to have a socialist welfare state, if you're going to not, how much, why, etc., etc. So you just don't talk about it. But you need to have some policies. Talk about foreign policy, you can say, well, what you want, it doesn't really matter. It's monopoly money policy. Most people don't care about foreign policy. Most voters don't care about foreign policy. So long as it's not too crazy, then it's absolutely fine. Okay, so in reality, by focusing on foreign policy, that massively helps. Now, the 1918 Representation of the People Act, which we're going to mention in a second, but you should know, also is a fundamental thing which helps them. The Representation of the People Act leads to the bottom 30% natural Labour voters getting the right to vote. Now, as we shall look in the coupon election, actually, most of them don't get the right to vote by 1918. It takes a little bit longer. But this massively increases an electorate who naturally will side with the Labour Party. And so, therefore, this is a huge opportunity for them. Okay. Likewise, with the trade unions increasing their size and their membership and their money as a result of the fact that the war has made trade unions more successful, this in turn means there are more members who are trade unions who are supporting the Labour Party and more money to go to the Labour Party. So because the trade unions improve as a result of the war, which we looked at last video lesson, the Labour Party improves. And as well as that, the war helps Labour because much like the war helps Liberals because the Labour rise. Part of the reason the war helps Labour is that the Liberals split as a result of the war, giving an opportunity to Labour to take in and take over. It's important to realise that everything isn't sweetie gumdrops and roses. There are still radicals in the parties, some amongst the unions, particularly in the Clyde side, where there is still some people who really advocate an anti-moderate line. And in reality, even today, this sort of vague sense that the Labour Party is fundamentally irrationally spending, overly socialist, etc., has not really left the Labour Party. But in reality, compared to the abject fear the idea of a Labour Party had brought in 1900, the war had only further developed this improvement sense that actually the Labour Party are just full of moderates. The Labour Party, yes, they're left-wing, yes, I disagree with their politics, but they aren't dangerous. They are ultimately good chaps. They are patriotic. So that's essentially the goal of MacDonald, and this is only continued as a result of World War I. Okay, so essentially, while it's not perfect, while there was still rhetoric and fears that the Labour Party might be too socialist, and they will never go away, it still had improved. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is how the war leads to the Representation of the People Act. I mentioned this briefly as part of the women's stuff last lesson, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. Essentially, it is this. You cannot let poor working class men who can't vote die in the Somme without promising them something. And there is a moral debt, and in reality, everyone in government knows that the first thing Labour is likely to do is say, these men have died in the Somme, you need to give them the right to vote. And then suddenly, instantaneously, even if you give them the vote the next day, you look like the bad guys and the Labour Party look like they've won. So you essentially need to think about electoral reform. As well as this, the unions had suggested it, Labour had suggested it, some Liberals had suggested it, and by the end, David Lloyd George, who saw it as inevitable, decided he would promise it as a carrot, so that people would sacrifice during the war. And more than that, if he promised it, it would be his policy. He was the one who kindly gave everyone the right to vote rather than being forced into it, which is deeply important for therefore getting support afterwards. So, in reality, it was politically impossible to give all men the right to vote over 21. Men who are over 21 the right to vote, because you've just fought a major war, they've died in the trenches, why aren't they allowed to vote? So what ends up happening is the Conservatives push for women over the age of 30 who had properties or their husbands had property, i.e. rich women, to get the right vote as well. This combination of rising the number of women as well as increasing the number of working classes triples the electorate from 7.7 million to 21.4 million. Now, a lot of this are poor people, but 43% of the electorate are women. There's lots of reasons why that is. A lot of men don't register for some reason. Well, because they're disinterested. And what this means is you would think this will naturally lead to, therefore we will have the Labour Party forever. But in reality, because rich women balance the unnaturally conservative voters, that balances the massive increase in poor workers who vote for the Labour Party. The only loser here are the Liberals. And in reality, by increasing the share of the vote for the Labour Party, balancing that with a share of vote for the Conservative Party, the Liberals are squeezed. And basically what we are looking at to explain this change between 1910 and 1918 and beyond is essentially long term, and we'll look at this far more in the lesson about Liberal divisions and the split in the Liberals and the decline of the Liberals. But for now, what is worth saying is that there is a long-term growth of the Labour Party, but which was not inevitable. It could have gone wrong. The party could have said something crazy socialist. It could have gone divided into its bickering factions. The unions could have given up on it. The Liberal Party had long-term problems about who does it appeal to in the age of mass politics, fundamental divisions in the parties, destructive leaders, and long-term socio-economic change hurting its base. But again, it wasn't inevitable that they would lose. They could just as easily become the new party of the left. But what happens in this period is the Liberals play this battle well and badly and then split and lose popular support. Whereas the Labour Party play it well, improve their image as a responsible party of government, improve their organisation, improve their centralisation, improve their moderation, and therefore go into 1918 far, far better, far more likely to win in the election. And so therefore what happens is we have that significant and pretty much permanent for the rest of this century trends towards the decline and end of the Liberals and the Labour Party being the natural party of opposition. So while the war isn't the only factor, and that this might well have happened afterwards, it certainly sped it up. Okay, that is the end of the part 1, 30 out of 50 marks of the paper. The next series of video lessons are likely to be later on in a few weeks because I need a break. Always remember that these are only giving the analytical arguments and the analysis you can use to show off. The evidence, because there's only so much time in the world, is not included in here unless it's particularly useful, or I suspect you won't be able to find it. Use the K-drive. The K-drive is absolutely useful for this. There is standard reading, there is medium reading, there is higher reading, and it will just give you all the facts you need to know. Apart from this, the message and lesson of this, remember that they will ask you most likely both 10 and 20 mark questions, and if you're doing the A2, just the 20 mark question will be on one of these many topics. You need to make sure that you know all of these topics inside out, because all of your questions, all the examples you are going to bring up will be about one of them. So you need to know about changing an attitude towards poverty, Balfour's government, the tariff reforms, new liberalism, the 1906 elections, pension reform, workers' rights reforms, national insurance reforms, education and young people's reforms, the constitution of crisis of 1909, the rise of the Labour Party, the suffragettes, the Irish question, the rise of industrial unrest, the home front, the effects on the economy, the effects on people's everyday lives, the political changes, how good was Asquith, why was there a change in government and David Lloyd George came to power, how good was David Lloyd George, the rise of the Labour Party, the fall of the Liberal Party, and how the war affects workers and unions, and how the war affects women. That is a long list, actually. You need to know this stuff. Focus your debate, focus your arguments on what the answer to each of those potential questions are. Focus your evidence on what you need to prove it. Work smart, not necessarily as hard as can be. Apart from that, enjoy, and I will see you for the next series of videos which will be focused on individual essays following the part 2.